Hello everyone, welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Cultural Perspective. So in this module, we are trying to historicize disability. We are looking at how disability was understood in the West and how disability is being interpreted, how disability is being defined, how disability can be explained until and unless we see the certain cultural context. For example, when we were explaining disability, when we were thinking about disability, then we saw that how disability evolved. For example, in a Greek culture, how disability was there, due to the industrialization, how it got affected, and when we proceeded, and when it came to in current times, how there was extra emphasis on perfecting the body. So there are certain historical important events, there are historical juncture, there are historical line which played a very important and significant role in shaping disability. So I'm sure that you might have noticed in my previous lecture that disability was not as it was, right? And slowly and gradually it proceeded and started getting different meaning in different context, in different time, in different zones. So therefore, when we are looking at disability, when we are thinking about it, our job is to understand that what are the cultural framework, theoretical framework. So for example, during the war times, disability was disabled people who got impaired during the war or in the war, facing the war, they were celebrated, they were highly eulogized. Oh wow, what a great things you did, right? So you see the connection that it has, like war is there. So people will be respectful to you if you are disabled or impaired during the war times. So here you see the connection that we have, what the Bible has to say, what the Judaism has to speak about disability. And after that, when we also noticed that during the industrialization, or let's say for example, medical institution when it started emerging, it started looking at disability very differently. It entered into our social domain, and this history of a medical model of disability. So these are the important idea. I'm just throwing you so that you can catch it up and analyze disability in your framework, the way you want to do, keeping these important nuances in your mind. So whatever the study you are doing, whatever the field that you have chosen, whatever the primary source have you chosen, it depends accordingly how you are going to do your research. So in this lecture, I am going to talk on the problem in disability history, right? The problem in disability history. So look at the first slide. In Marxist thought, disability is framed in terms of an individual's functional role in society, with an emphasis on their utility within their community and environment. Look, hold on for a second before we move further. As if we read Marx, as I have already told you explicitly that to understand disability, we need to read Marx, Freud, Darwin, every other social thinkers, political, cultural, because they all have contributed in some way or other way in disability studies or in shaping disability studies, in shaping the understanding of disability. Here the Marx what is talking about that you are valuable only if you are playing a very important functional role in our society. And if you are not contributing in our society, Marx basically mean through the labor power, financially if you are not contributing, you are less useful for the society. So your utility, there is emphasis on your utility. Are you useful or not? You are going to be dehumanized if you are not useful to the society. That is exactly what industrialization did to the society. And you remember, this is what the point I have been making since started this lecture, that rural and urban setup, right? So Talcott persons, which I already talked about, the concept of Sikh role has also been influential, helping to consolidate the medical model of disability within sociology. So historians have further explored how disability is rooted in ideas of abnormality, subnormality, and more fundamentally, the fear of the unknown. So people with disabilities were conceptualized as if they are unknown. So because how it happens, let me make it more simple. So first, infrastructure is built in such a way that only certain parts of certain body can only work and they can access the infrastructure. So obviously people with disability will not be able to access the space, right? And if you are not shown so often into the society, you will be treated as if you are unknown. Abnormality is also very tightly linked with disability. Margaret Shedlock, Janet Price, in fact Foucault, you read the abnormal, dangerous individuals. They all have George Cairngorm, right? He's talking about the normal and the pathological. So they all are talking about that how medically you are produced as a deemed unfit, and that contribute in shaping you as abnormal, unknown to the society. And obviously, as I have talked already about the Talcott persons, the idea of a Sikh role, right? How a person who is sick is also on the pressure to become fit, to become healthy, and he has excuse to say that I will like to take a leave, and leave will be granted because you are sick. So how does society function? What is the role of the sick is? So this study of confinement institution gained traction with Foucault's seminal work, Madness and Civilization. Very famous book, very important seminal book for people with people who are working in disability studies, which examined isolation as a logic behind institutional segregation, right? A historical form of oppression experienced by people labeled as lepers, lunatics, and the impoverished. So their isolation was justified. This hospital, like if you look at the history of Madness and Civilization, this book talks about how hospitals came into the existence. How hospitals, like before there was no hospitals. So medical institution plays a very pivotal role in justifying isolation of certain forms of bodies. So this book talks about that what is the role of, like how civilization was built. The idea of civilization is to isolate certain bodies which are not getting trained in certain ways. So if you do not behave in a particular way, which is so called the idea of civilization is, you will be treated as disabled. That is what that's what Foucault is talking about, that oppression plays a very pivotal role in the evolution of civilization. Civilization is possible because repression is possible. Without repression, there is no civilization. Repression has to take place if civilization has to take place. They go simultaneously, right? Certain people are privileged because some people are not privileged. Some bodies are produced as a fit because it is constantly telling that someone is not fit. So this is what, like even Marx is talking the same idea. So many studies note the term like disability, disablement, social stigma, they now carry a normalized discursive weight reflecting how these concepts are currently understood and discussed. Right? So it's like it has become normal, right? If people with disability are stigmatized in our society, it's perfectly normal. No one is going to question that's natural. That's a problematic, right? How certain concepts are understood and how they are discussed. They are discussed in relation to civilization. So, no one finds it a problematic if people with disabilities are discriminated. So, a relatively recent area of study in disability history is the theological perspectives on disability and disablement. Research in disability and theology often offers contextual discussion, exploring how present-day universalized social views on disablement intersect with a specific theological concepts such as charity that arose with the historical framework from the church, right? Charity, the genesis of charity is starting from the church. How disability discrimination with people with disabilities are justified has also roots in theology. How the idea of morality and immorality is constructed, you can only understand if you delve into the theology, right? So, foundational work in this field is Henry Jacques Steiker's A History of Disability, in which he clearly notes that his focus is on Western history, a point that may be overlooked by some readers, right? So, if you look at this book, it's a very interesting book, A History of Disability. Steiker, he's talking about how, in fact, he talks about almost all religions, not the South Asian and some African, but important religions in the West. In fact, he touches also Quran and all. But the point what I'm making is this, that he has explained beautifully how disability was understood in the Western context, how religion played a very pivotal role in shaping disability. So, Steiker's work traces the theological underpinning of disability, starting with the representation in the Old Testament and exploring notions such as biblical prohibitions, ancient tetralogy, and social segregation of individuals during plagues and outbreaks of leprosy. From these analyses, he formulates a conceptual typology. Terms like profanity, defect, impurity, blemish, deformity, and subnormal, they all are interlinked. Steiker shows that within Judaic tradition, conditions like blindness, lameness, certain illness were viewed as impurities of the flesh. These theological framing associated bodily deformities and illness with deviations from culturally defined standards of purity and wholeness, which were seen as a more significant ideals. So, Steiker also highlights an ethical mandate within this context, emphasizing society's responsibility to situate the disabled within society. This included moral prescriptions to restrain violence against those with deformities, defining these restraint as a component of moral conduct, right? So, the point what I'm talking about is this, that how this, in this book here, like I'm just talking about certain ideas which are explained in this book, that how in a given context, ethics is very much associated with the bodies, ethics. And obviously how, in fact, in my book also I have explained it, the lexicon of disability studies, that how impurity, defect, blemish, deformity, subnormal, abnormal, disease, they all are freak, they all have a different history, they all are not the same, they have a different meaning, they have a different genesis, they are different bodies, but since they all are tagged in one way, conceptual typologies, right? They are segregated because society did not find them perfect, ideal, what religion has to say on them, and then not only people with disabilities, all other forms of bodies were also considered as disabled. That's why the last point I'm making is the ethical mandate within this context. This is emphasizing society's responsibility to situate disabled within the society. So they included also the moral prescription to restrain violence against those with deformities, defining this restraint as a component of moral conduct, right? So we should feel pity on them, we should not feel bad, so that violence will not take place, right? And that is how they became an object of pity and also fear. So with New Testament, Stryker observes an evolution in religious perspectives, where the evil of mind or the wicked were designed as outcast rather than those with physical impairments. The shift introduced intentionally in understanding individual subjectivity with a corresponding obligation of charitable attitude toward marginalized persons. Charity, as Stryker described it, is characterized by disinterested love of one's fellow human beings, making a shift in how disabled people were to be perceived and treated. So look at the shift I'm talking about, right? Like they were still part of the society in the Old Testament. Now they have become outcast, right? So this exploring various studies on conception of charity in Western society reveals that its theological roots are closely intertwined with ideas of faith, home and love. It notes that St. Augustine emphasized the connection between charity and the almsgiver's path to salvation in Christian society. So while recipient of alms may benefit, the goal of almsgiving was not necessarily aimed at social reform. So both Stryker and Stinson highlight evolving perspectives on charity and almsgiving in the West. So present critiques of charitable practices in Western societies often stem from the historical religious undertones of charity, which may have implied a sense of detachment from its recipients. So this entire slide I am talking about, why I am explaining this to you, so that you can just understand how disability evolved, what is the understanding of the disability in the Old Testament and what is the understanding of disability in the New Testament. They are significant, they are important, and then you can see how the idea of a charity, another thing understood. So look at the Stenson's point out the interpreting charity as a means of social reform may be a misconception rooted in a period of religious significance and extended into secular context. He illustrates this with examples such as almshouses that developed around the church regarding intellectual disability. Station argues that early church paradigm heavily influenced modern attitudes and concepts surrounding intellectual disability. For example, he examines the Augustines of Hippo as a key figure who helped shape doctrines relating to reason, human values and citizenship, which informed society's treatment of intellectual disability through frameworks of charity and at times confinement. However, Stenson cautions against categorizing Augustine's views as a purely discriminatory or favorable. Augustine's thought emphasized inclusivity, arguing that even monstrous beings as he described them had a place within God's divine plan, despite their lack of reason by human standards. These complex perspectives reflect Augustine's view of all human beings, regardless of their abilities, as a part of greater divine design, right? So the point what I am trying to make is this, that how it evolved, how Santon and Stryker is talking about it. So when we go back to the Amos, Young argues that a significant aspect of Western disability history is the rise of care institutions, so shaped by theological ideas of care, charity and shelter. So there is a biblical and theological emphasis on healing, right? So he influenced modern medical practice, particularly in mental health. So contemporary medical understanding of conditions like Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities are fundamentally based on theological presupposition. Extending Foucault's thesis on institutional power, Jung examines the history of asylum as an oppressive space for developmentally disabled people, where they were continuously subjected to scrutiny by a range of experts, including physicians, psychologists, and scientists. So practices like sterilization were implemented to prevent future birth of feeble-minded, while understaffed asylum often prioritized maintenance over rehabilitation. So public exposure of mistreatment within these institutions eventually led to a push for deinstitutionalization. So you see that what I'm doing in this lecture, I'm talking about, I'm just giving you the kind of a history, I'm traveling one by one. Obviously, I cannot go into the details of each important event and what it has to say about disability, but I'm just giving you a kind of idea so that you can understand that how disability was conceptualized in a particular time, how disability was viewed, like starting from the Old Testament, when we have a asylum getting emerging, rehabilitation coming in the existence. So how they all are connected, how one by one, if you see, there is a continuity as well as disjuncture in the evolution of disability, understanding of disability, right? The conceptualization of disability. So where the people are now, isolation is justified, segregation is being justified. People are paying attention to this. Stigma is taking place when people with disabilities are segregated. They are found, they are represented as a feeble-minded people, and obviously intellectual disabled people face a different form of a discrimination in comparison to physical disabilities. So I'm not comparing any, I'm just saying that there is a different form of oppression, there is a different form of segregation, there are different forms of exclusion when we trace the history of disability. So the concept that medicalizing a physical or intellectual condition inherently results in discriminatory attitudes, that has roots in Western history. However, when we attempt to apply concepts from one cultural context to another, such as India, complications arise. Concepts like medicalization often lack an equivalent experiential history in non-Western societies, where they have largely emerged through colonial influence, introducing a new framework for perceiving and understanding the world. For example, scholars of Indian medical history point out that the idea of disease was not traditionally part of the Indian context until the advent of modern medicine through colonial rule and European education. Consequently, discussing the history of smallpox in India solely as the history of disease may overlook the cultural meaning it had prior to modern medical histories. So similarly, if Western models of disability history are adopted as a universal templates for analyzing disability in diverse cultural context, there is a risk of merely retelling the same story with minor cultural adjustment. This approach risks overlooking culturally distinct experiences. We must avoid this pitfall by uncovering and understanding indigenous experiences of bodily difference rather than disability in the Indian context. So, the whole point, what I am trying to make to conclude this lecture, is that the context determines the meaning. How certain institutions emerge with certain influence. It's not that they have experiential history. As I talked, that disability, or let's say for example disease for a second, was unknown phenomena to the Indian society, it is because of the colonial influence. It was imposed on Indians to understand disability in a certain way. Let's say, for example, a smallpox case I am talking about. The case of smallpox is very new to Indian society. It's not the way we understand smallpox is different, but after the Western influence and the way it was treated as a disease, as I talked about, it's not the new phenomena. It's a very old disease is a new phenomena. It's not very old phenomena because smallpox was there. I'm not saying smallpox was not there, but I'm saying that the way it was understood is different. The way we started treating it is different. The way we started experiencing it, people with smallpox, is different. So the point what I'm trying to make is that we need to avoid these pitfalls. We need to uncover and understand indigenous experience of bodily differences. They are important to know disability studies in India or how people with disabilities are treated and understood in India. I am not negating the very fact that they were not ignored or discriminated. But what I am arguing is that we need to also look at the influence it has of the West, of colonies and others. So think in that way to understand what disability do to us, what certain framework do to us. Alright. So in the coming lectures, I will contextualize and we'll see how history was, what is the history of disability in India, how it was projected, how it was represented, what is the historiography of disability in India. So with this, I would like to end my lecture and thank you so much for your patience. See you in the next lecture. We'll talk more on disability in the Indian context. We'll bring the more examples from Indian context now. Thank you so much.